Well, the BBC's Director General has floated the idea that wealthier Brits should pay more for the BBC licence fee.
Could this be a fairer way of charging viewers? And exactly who counts as wealthy? Who will be paying more? Well, we're going to debate this general principle now. Joining us to discuss this is the former BBC executive and presenter Roger Bolton, who thinks that richer paying more in practice is a great idea, and the former BBC News producer and director of Newswatch, David Keeley, who thinks that this is further nonsense from the BBC. Well, David, strong words. Let's start with you.
Yes, I think it's nonsense. First of all, as well, I think it's political opportunism. It's rather rather interesting, the timing of this. Just as Labour is expected to be elected, up comes the Director General of the BBC with a message: "Let's cane the rich in the licence fee." I think underneath that, though, there are other objections in that. How on earth will this be administered? It means that there's already a huge bureaucracy involved in collecting the licence fee. What the corporation will have to do in some way is find out who is rich and who is not. And how they're going to do that, I just don't know. So I think it's a non-flyer. And I think it's, yet again, the BBC trying to save its own hide, coming up with a political opportunist way of doing things.
I mean, Roger, we said you said the rich should pay more. In practice is a great idea. I think we meant in theory is a good idea. In practice, it might be difficult. I would argue that rich people already pay more tax. So why on earth should they pay more for the BBC licence fee as well?
Well, you could take the view that everybody should pay the same for everything, which means that the rich do rather well, don't they? And the rather poor don't do very well at all. And if you're talking about a public service, you're trying to provide something for everybody, regardless of how rich or how poor they are. So that's the fundamental problem. How do you provide it for everybody and enable everybody to have access? The rich will always have access. They can do anything. Of course, people say if you've got enough money, you can do anything you can. But what about those people who haven't? Do they to be denied these services? So the question is how you pay for it. And the present system, as David would argue, is regressive in the sense that everybody pays the same, although there are some people who get it for nothing, but everybody saves the same. So in principle, the idea that the better off should pay more than the worse off for a national service is reasonable, I think, and that's our approach generally to taxation, isn't it? Income tax and so on is based upon a graduation, so those who are the poorest pay least. As a principle, I don't oppose it. I think it's difficult in practice. But I think the debate ought to be, do we need public service broadcasting? Is the BBC the best way of delivering it? And how much should we pay for it? And the Director General's speech did, thank heaven, and not before time, promise a really proper consultation period with the public about what they want. Because their BBC is not the DG's BBC, it's theirs. So do we want public service broadcasting? Is the BBC still the best way of delivering it? How do we pay for it? That's the order of events we do.
Let's throw these questions right back over because, frankly, the idea of public service broadcasting to some extent has been undermined in recent years, with the BBC chasing after audiences rather than doing things that the market might not necessarily provide itself.
Well, it's got to do two things, hasn't it? It has to do with market failure. And where there's market failure, children's programming, not having, you've got to do market failure. Then, on the other hand, it has to provide something for everybody if everybody's paying for it. So it's always had to ride these two horses.
Well, hang on, David, what's your view? Do you think it is fairer the BBC is seen as a public service and therefore, those with the broadest shoulders should pay more and the BBC as an institution is worth protecting? What's your view?
I think the broadcasting environment, since the BBC was founded over 100 years ago now, has changed beyond recognition. And we all know why that is happening. There's streaming services. And I think the question for the next BBC charter period, because that's what Tim Davie was discussing, and I agree with Roger here, is where does the BBC fit into that? And obviously there are different opinions on that. I don't think personally, and I know a lot of other people don't think, that the BBC can survive as the monolith it is at the moment, trying to please everyone, and not succeeding. I also think that what the Director General should be looking at in this review as well is just how impartial the BBC is. It's relevant. There are an awful lot of people out there saying in surveys that they're no longer convinced that the BBC is impartial, and that's part of what just be.
Yeah.
Can you just let me finish?
David,
I think that is something else that should be brought into the equation here.
Now, David, just as a former news person, David, you recognise that when the country is very divided, be it foreign policy, say Gaza, Israel, or at home, the BBC gets it in the neck. So it would be inevitable that when the country is divided, the BBC is thought to be less impartial by those who are committed. I mean, you yourself are a committed person on the right. You lobbied in this way. There are other people on the left who would argue the BBC is biased towards the right. When you get really divisive issues, that's when the BBC is under the cosh. It's not surprising. It doesn't mean it's less impartial. It's mean that we are more of a divided country.
David?
I don't believe that the BBC understands the impartiality issue anymore. I don't think that Tim Davie, although he came into his post saying that he was going to make impartiality his number one priority, I don't think he's done anything to redress the concerns that there are out there at the moment. I know
that's not true.
again with Roger that the Britain is more divided in some ways, but the BBC, I think, has progressively become more biased in its coverage of lots of issues.
We are running to the end of this section. I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. But gentlemen, thank you so much for your impassioned views. You've put across your cases, both in your usual eloquent ways. Thank you.